Women as a cultural group diversity training. If I want to define myself, I first have to say I am a woman. All other assertions will arise from this basic truth. A man never begins by positing himself as an individual of a certain sex. That he is a man is obvious. Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. Her theory of the other is a cornerstone of contemporary feminist theory that influences how we see identity and power and money. And it begins and revolves around the assertion that gender is a social construct that positions women as the opposition to men, rather it being something natural inherent, and women are defined in relation to men and not as individuals. So I'll be going over some basics of Western feminism, women's history, and contextualize the implications, applications, or lack thereof to the modern workspace. So early Western feminism was introduced by the temperance movement, and the first wave was focused on personhood, suffrage, and education for white women in particular. The second wave was in the 60s and 70s, and it was inspired by the Civil Rights Movement. The Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, Roe v. Wade 10 years later, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act 1 year later. The third wave feminism focused on individual agency, personal relationship to gender and sexuality. Intersectionality was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, which is a framework that recognizes that different people in different marginalized groups will have unique and different special privileges and obstacles depending on their social categorizations, and choice feminism emerged. We're currently in the fourth wave, which is believed to have started in the 2010s. It's an expansion on the third: body positivity, neutrality, and inclusivity, online activism, the Me Too movement. This is what that's known for. There haven't been particular policies that have been passed that have been beneficial. The Paycheck Fairness Act has been stalled by the Senate for 4 years, and Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. But now that we've gone over the history, let's kind of contextualize that to the modern workspace. So I've inserted a diagram over here that kind of helps understand how intersectionality works, and some studies from the Pew Institute from 2022 on the gender wage gap and how Black and Hispanic women experience it the worst. Some Bureau of Labor statistics of women in management occupations, and according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, women make up 47% of the workforce, and 39% of them work in jobs where women make up 3/4 of the staff. So these are all industries that are underpaid and undervalued. Studies show that being a mother is equivalent to working 2.5 full-time jobs, but labor associated with them, like caregiving and teaching, is not respected. The National Education Association actually had conducted 4 studies recently that report that U.S. educators face low wages and a lack of professional respect. This is a direct result of misogyny. And I was a substitute for multiple years, and I can definitely attest to this. Just seeing how everything has kind of shifted, just very traditional and conservative, it's really obvious in the children too. It's so surprising. But since we're on the topic of feminine roles being undervalued in society, that brings me to stereotypes and cultural biases, earlier renditions of them, and some ramifications. In an article titled "What We Say and What We Think About Female Managers: Explicit versus Implicit Associations of Women with Success," published to Psychology of Women Quarterly in June 2011, the authors Ayana Latua et al. Have kindly cited and compiled a short list of multiple studies and their findings during research on implicit biases. So I've listed them over here in white. They're elementary school teachers, family, humanities, egalitarian. Alice H. Eagley at Northwestern University considers a ramification of this in her paper that was published to Psychology Review in 2022 titled "The Role Congruity Theory of Prejudice Towards Female Leaders," that proposes that there's a perceived incongruity between female gender roles and leadership roles, and that leads to 2 forms of prejudice. Not seeing women as good candidates of leadership roles, and then when they act like leaders, it's unbecoming of them and it doesn't sit well. It's not very ladylike. So we went over the positive stereotypes like teachers, humanitarian, egalitarian, what have you. Now let's go over some negative ones. There's an incomplete and perfect man. That goes all the way back to 3rd century with Aristotle. Irrational. Women have a long history with the catch-all diagnosis of hysteria. Comes from the Greek word for uterus, and it didn't start being used until the 80s. 10th century BC is when the book of Genesis was written, when a single woman's actions condemned all of humanity to a mortal life of sin, pain, and death. And childbirth was implicated as something more like a humiliation ritual than being divine, despite the only people capable of creation in that way are AFAB. And then their subjugation being sanctioned by God. There's that quote right there. And some ramifications of this are medical misogyny. Women have been treated in ways that are harmful due to a lack of research because male at birth is considered the default. Aristotle literally said the female body was the inverse and that their genitalia was turned outside in. So this bias even goes all the way to lab rats. Up until about 6 years ago, they weren't even used during clinical trials because their hormone cycles were thought to disrupt data collection, which again is not true. And when misogynistic patriarchal ideals like these are codified into science, which is something that we take as real and for the most part not up for debate, they're not only reinforced but they're amplified. This manifests and shows up every day in workplace communication, with women using indirect, apologetic, collaborative language. Think, I'm sorry, I was just wondering. Not being very self-assured. Whispering. Some interpersonal strategies are navigating double binds, because if you're assertive, you're bossy. If you're warm, you're unserious. And according to a meta-analysis of published literature on gender leadership, upward mobility for women managers, Styles and Perceptions Part 2, the authors had found that the most effective leadership style is the transformational leadership, which is the style most associated with women. Some other extra info that is surprising: women rate themselves and their contributions in the workplace lower than men. Being humble does not benefit us, and it's not surprising that happens at all. But some actionable steps we can take to interrupt the perpetuation of these stereotypes and misconceptions are naming harms, calling out microaggressions, things that make you uncomfortable, like being interrupted, pet names ignored, especially when it's happening to someone else. Audre Lorde refers to these injustices that we face on a daily basis but ignore to maintain a culture of social niceties called swallowed tyrannies. We can practice allyship. I watched a TED Talk where a CEO had talked about her and her coworker decided to brag on each other to their boss when they worked on Wall Street so they could stand out but not come off as unpleasant as women, right? We can encourage participation from everyone, address our own personal biases, be curious, and reframe our own ideals of leadership. If the feminine issue is so absurd, it is because the male arrogance made it a discussion. Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, 1949. Thank you.